Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm so excited to be here today with Lisa Ampleman, editor of Cincinnati Review. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you for taking time.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Doing good today? Everything good?
Yes.
Yeah.
Got sunshine. It's a good day.
Yeah, great. Well, let's jump right in. I was looking at Cincinnati Review, the site, and I was actually surprised to see you guys were founded in 2003, which is relatively recent. Like when I think of Cincinnati Review, I think of this like old guard, one of the old guard journals. But yeah, it's pretty new. Can you talk about like the founding, why, what inspired people to start it? Were you involved with the initial launch of the journal? And yeah, just the origin story.
Sure. So there was a Cincinnati Poetry Review that preceded us, unrelated to the university. And so some people who are around still remember that and mention their appearance in that journal. But yeah, we got started in 2003, and the department at the university, the Department of English, wanted to set up a literary journal to support the graduate program, as well as to have said journal and be working on promoting creative writing more widely on a national scale. And they had this idea, and right around the same time, Nicola Mason moved to the area with her husband, Michael Griffith, who was hired as a fiction professor. And they both had extensive experience with the Southern Review and LSU Press. And so we almost feel like those are cousins of ours in a way, because our founder, it wasn't, the idea didn't come from her, but she was the first one to do the work of putting things together. Nicola was trained at Southern Review. Okay. So yeah, I mean, from 2003 until 2017, Nicola Mason was Cincinnati Review. And when I look back at those early issues, they seem shorter. And so I'm like, ooh, it would be nice to go back to a shorter magazine. But it also, like from the beginning, it had that traditional look that I think is why you feel like it's been around for a long time. Yeah. And they were able to establish themselves very early with strong writers and, publishing the emerging writers who end up becoming pretty well known.
Yeah, I think that's why I have that impression, because I think of it as like one of the top tier, very prestigious, very competitive journals. So that automatically made me think, oh, it must have been around forever. But I'm also curious, like, I don't know if you know, like, what is the secret sauce? Like, how does a journal become like a top tier journal?
That is a good question. I think some of it, good or not, has to do with the anthologies, like the best of anthologies, the O. Henry, and things like that. So I know in the first few years, they had pieces picked up by Best American Essays and places like that. And so I think that, and the fact that it was started by people who already had experience in the lit mag world, I think that's part of it. I feel like the top tier thing often also includes the submission to acceptance rate, which for us is pretty low. But I have to be honest, like, I don't know that is it either. I think magazines that find a wide readership that thinks that the work in the magazine is worth seeing in other venues, whether it's the author's publications or the yearly anthologies.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's go back to basics. So you guys publish 3 times a year? Twice. Okay.
Twice a year.
Fiction, poetry, drama. I love seeing that because it's not frequent that the mags publish drama. And what else?
Literary nonfiction.
Okay.
So essays and things like that. We also have a review feature most issues. And we have an art portfolio, a full color glossy paper art portfolio in every issue that usually matches the artist on the front cover.
Okay, and do you solicit the visual artists, or do they come?
We do, yes. Okay. Yeah, we rotate who works on the selection and curation of that portfolio. We also have an online series that started in 2018 And we publish one piece a week. It's flash fiction and nonfiction or hybrid work, so 500 words or less, and poems 32 lines or less.
Okay.
So that's also been a place of growth for us, I would say.
And is the content, sounds like there's a little bit of a difference between what is published online versus print.
Yeah, we do definitely publish poems that are 32 lines or less in the magazine. And same thing, we've published flash in the magazine as well. But we had the opportunity when we were starting it to have direct curation by our graduate student editors. And the other thing is, although we had a place in the magazine for flash fiction, we had seen that flash fiction online has become it's almost like a community. Like I see people on Twitter praising each other, encouraging each other. They've been in workshops together, and we were excited to tap into that kind of creative well and help them find readers.
Yeah, that's great. And do you feel like you have, like, the stuff is connecting with that particular group?
Definitely, yeah. And I can almost tell when someone who has been in workshops with, say, Kathy Fish, who's a big name in that community, publishes and says something, there's a lot of conversation about it. And that was the other thing. I feel like the print magazine world has a certain cachet, but I also see writers, especially of younger generations, connecting more with creative writing online, just because of the nature of how they experience text.
Yeah.
And we wanted to update our website and have a space for things like that.
Yeah. So you mentioned it was for the graduate students. So can you talk about the editorial process? Is it, are the editors MFA students, and how does that work?
Yeah, so we have an MA and a PhD program. And we see I think I mentioned this kind of in the beginning, but I feel like we have a dual mission. We have the mission to put out that excellent piece of creative writing in the magazine, but also to train the future set of editors and professionals in the field of publishing. And so every year I have 3 doctoral students who work for me in lieu of teaching. So it's a graduate assistantship, and they get paid the same as the people who are teaching. And instead, they're spending 20 hours a week working with me. And so they are writing blog posts, they're reading submissions, they're curating the micro, they're working together with the genre editors on content selection. And then they are also taking on professional projects of their own choice. So I have had students who are interested in email newsletter analytics, for example. They're like, when I graduate, I want to make sure I know how to say that I know how to do that.
Oh, yeah.
So that's just an example, but so yeah, the time fills up. They do a little bit of solicitation of writers, but most of what we accept comes straight through the queue. And we do have some volunteers. So our staff structure is this. I'm technically a half-time person. And then I have a colleague, Matt O'Keefe, who's our senior associate editor. He's also permanent and half-time. And he oversees our submission manager and making sure submissions are going out to people and moving through the process, as well as some of our marketing efforts. And so what happens when a piece comes in is that the first reader is often a volunteer, although it might be one of those student editors if they're caught up with the rest of their reading, and it might be me if I'm, pulling straight from the queue. And those volunteers are going through a semester process where we talk about, here's some pieces that we read, and these are the scores we've given them. And we read behind them in the beginning, especially, and make sure they're kind of normed to what we would expect for the numbers they're giving to submissions. And then, so the volunteer reads it, and then one of the student editors read it, and they can either, reject or send up to the genre editors to have a conversation with them about the strengths of that piece. And again, occasionally I'm the first reader, and I'm the one to send it on to the student editors who are in that genre team, so to speak. But usually a piece gets at least 2 readers. And we have 4 genre editors who make the final selections, again, with some of those student editors, but it's a small staff for the size of magazine we are. We do a lot with a small amount of people.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm always curious with these journals that use MFA or PhD students, like, is there a different kind of vision for the magazine with every new crop of students, or how do you sort of create that consistency over time?
Yeah, that's something that's really important to us, the idea of continuity. And part of what keeps that for the print magazine in particular is the genre editors. So we have people who have published in their fields: Rebecca Lindenberg in poetry, Michael Griffith in fiction, Kristen Iverson in literary nonfiction, and then Brant Russell, who curates our drama area. And so they're working with the students, and they're kind of working together as a team, which is something we just started in the last year or so. Before, the genre editors would just make the decisions, and we're trying to incorporate them more to think about curation in a more direct way. And so that's part of it. And then for the online series, I definitely do see differences in the blog styles and the kind of choice of blog topics. But I feel like our micro series, even though it's different editors, we talk as a staff about what the micro pieces can do, and how, because they're online, we have to think about, what have you seen online that many people have read? What is there a social valence to it in some way? Something that will get people talking beyond just, I really like this poem. Yeah. And so I think that, there's definitely some different editorial choices, but I feel like it, as a series, when you look at the broad piece, it all kind of comes together, if that makes sense. Yeah. But yeah, it's important to us to have that continuity for sure.
Sure. So I remember when I was with the Review a million years ago, we reviewed an issue of Cincinnati Review. I totally forget which issue it was, but I remember the reviewer describing that particular issue as surreal. Like, there was a lot of work that seemed surreal. And I'm wondering, and I've always associated that with Cincinnati Review. And I'm wondering was that true just for that particular issue, or is that something that is part of the aesthetic of Cincinnati Review? And can you talk more about, like, the particular aesthetic and stuff you guys really like to see?
Sure. I think it's, I should probably talk about each genre one at a time because it differs. So for fiction, we definitely publish straight realism at times, and we've had some really strong pieces in that vein. But yeah, I mean, we're definitely interested in surreal, or I think that the term has become more speculative these days. We have a history of taking chances on pieces like that. I know they're more in vogue than they were perhaps a decade ago, but things that are trying something new and getting away with it. And so yeah, I think we can't, every now and then we'll do a really long piece, but I'd say we average something that would be about 20 double spaced pages. That's like our average length for a fiction piece. Although lately we've had a lot of shorter pieces too, not exactly flash, but shorter short stories. For poetry, we have a wide range of what we publish. Like, we've published formalist poems, we've published more elliptical poems that are all over the page. And so we've even published some things broadside, so that we can retain the intentions of the poet. But I do think that, we are interested in things that are taking a chance in some way, whether it's with how they're handling their subject matter, the form on the page, having something that surprises us, etc. And then for literary nonfiction, we've published a lot of lyric essays. Every now and then we'll have a more narrative, memoirish piece. But I think that it's the pieces that we found in our queue that are strongest seem to be the lyric essay, which all of this might be also just the waves that are happening in the literary community itself. So I imagine that certain numbers of our peers are doing similar things. And then for drama, our drama editor is especially interested in pieces that are taking some sort of risk, pieces that are, in progress, haven't been staged, 10 different places already, and that, connect to the zeitgeist in some particular way.
Yeah.
And it's also important for us with all of that to think about the makeup of who our authors are, who are our contributors. Are we making sure to give space to every kind of voice that deserves it these days?
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting, the idea of risk. I hear people talk about this all the time. I talk about it as a writing instructor, and I don't always know what it means. So can you, and I think writers here would be really curious, like, how do you define risk? Do you mean like aesthetic risks, like it is experimental in some way, or do you mean emotional risks, or any number of things? Yeah, if you could talk about that.
Sure. I think a little bit of both, depending on the piece. So we're definitely interested in things that do something differently with structure or content. And I think of a story that we published that moved almost like a lyric essay. It was kind of braided in the way a lyric essay can be, and it moved back and forth in time, but yet it all came together and cohered. So also that idea of emotional risk, because I feel like some of the strongest pieces that we end up publishing in poetry or nonfiction, for example, the poet or writer is being vulnerable in some way that isn't sentimental or narcissistic. Like there's some self-reflection, self-implication. I think that's a term that we use, especially with literary nonfiction, quite a bit. And I think that becomes true for characters within fiction as well. And, I feel like, too, the idea of risk is this writer is doing something that they haven't seen 10 or 20 other writers do. Like they're doing something a little bit different than all the reading that they've done, if that makes sense.
It does. But what do you mean by self-implication?
Okay, so let me think a little bit about how to say this. So if you're writing a personal essay in particular, although I think poems can go in this direction as well, and you have some narrative elements and some scenes, and you have meditations that weave things together, and if that's all at a remove, and you're not saying, wait a minute, how am I implicated in all of this? And do some of that work. I think I'll talk about an example from our fall issue, which is coming out hopefully in November, but because of the printing industry backups these days, it might be later than that. So we have an essay called The Fifth Arch by Ryan Habermeyer, and it incorporates so many different things. So he talks about the concept of the arch, and he talks about that in ancient Chinese architecture. He talks about it in nature. He talks about it in terms of embryonic development and the arches within the embryo that develop into certain systems. And as I was reading, I was like, wow, this is fantastic, but he's not necessarily implicating himself in all these things that he's talking about. He also talks about whales quite a bit in that piece. And then a couple, like maybe 5 or 6 pages in, he does start to implicate himself. He talks about his home life, and he has a line about his wife saying, now I understand Medea. And he kind of looks at his relationship with his kids and says, well, I could have done a better job. I'm saying this a lot less creatively than Ryan did, of course. But I think it's that, like, it's not just looking at things, but it's talking about how you are connected to, in good and bad ways, to the material you're talking about. So for example, like like a travelogue is not as interesting as a travelogue where someone's like, wait a minute, I was definitely very privileged in that moment, and I wish I would have behaved differently, or something like that. You know what I mean? Yeah.
And is that something you look for in fiction as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in that sense, it would be related in some ways to the narrators, but I'll be honest, like I read a lot of fiction and I have opinions about fiction, but I'm not a craft person. So it's harder for me to think about that. But yeah, ways in which the characters become self-implicated. Like I feel like the anti-hero or the complicated hero is almost a trope these days. But, you know, characters are complex. And I think that ways in which the characters, oh, I'll give another example. We have a story called For Sure, It's a Jacked Up World by Andreas Trolf in our forthcoming fall issue. And it's in the voice of a teenage girl who's having some challenging family things going on. You know, she makes a kind of horrific choice toward the end. And she does it in a way that, you know, she's not praising herself. She's not fully criticizing herself. She's putting it within the context of everything else. And so yeah, in that sense, I think it makes sense.
That's so interesting. So in fiction, it almost sounds like a more complicated portrait of a character, a more messy portrait of a character that's like not a morally neat character.
Yeah. Again, I don't think everything that we publish does that. Sure. But you know, that if you want me to draw a line between all the genres,
it's so interesting from a writer's perspective, like, how do you do that? Really interesting. So tell us, like, what are some submissions that you guys see a lot of where you're like, this is just not right for us, I really wish people would read the guidelines because this is not what we do?
So for nonfiction, sometimes we'll see things that are political diatribes, like not even, they're just not literary essays. They're essays, but they're just not right for us. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we'll see flat out academic style essays, which again, we're not really doing. And so we try to post excerpts from the prose pieces and examples of the poems on our website so that people who can't afford a sample issue are available to see it. We also have digital issues available for $5. I should put in a plug for that. But I feel like, let me think about the other, that's the one that really sticks out to me as not fitting. I mean, I know you've probably had other editors talk about the styles of poetry that don't really fit in literary magazines. And, you know, that don't seem to be in conversation with contemporary poetry or aware of the kinds of poetry we publish. And, you know, I'm a poet myself, and I feel like there's a place for different kinds of poetry in different places. And so, yeah, we are not necessarily going to publish something that is centered on the page and has a lot of end rhyme, end stopped end rhyme, and is talking about love. You know, the kind of thing that you've read a lot of, that Hallmark does a really good job with. And so there's a place for those kinds of poems. It's important within personal lives and et cetera. But, you know, we're publishing different kinds of things. Sure. For fiction, I'm less sure too. I mean, again, it's like, are you aware of the conventions and the kinds of things we're publishing? We get a lot of reunion stories.
Oh, really?
So I think that's hard to do well because there are so many of them.
Like reunion, like people, like friends and family, like coming back together?
Some of that, and then literal high school or college reunion
stories.
Yeah.
That's so funny. No editor has mentioned that particular trope. I didn't even know that was a thing.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a thing. And I had a fellow, so I forgot to say that I started as one of those graduate student editors when I was in the doctoral program. So I worked for the magazine from 2011 to 2013, and then I graduated and did some other things. And then when my predecessor, Nicola Mason, went on to form Acre Books, I had the opportunity to apply for and got this job. So I've been here since 2017 as the managing editor. But I had a fellow student editor who called it the girl I used to know idea as well. And like thinking back on that, we also tend to have a lot. So we talked about the messy hero. Sometimes we have stories that try to have that anti-hero, but they don't get away with it because they're not clearly criticizing that sort of moves. And so they're just reifying or reenacting the sorts of racist or sexist or whatever-ist, classist kind of things that they're trying to work against, if that makes sense. And then what's the final thing? Oh, I had something else in mind, but it's gone from my head right now. I think I'll stop there. If I think of it, I'll say it later.
Did you guys see a lot of COVID submissions?
We've seen some, yeah. And we're actually publishing an essay in our fall issue. I feel like I'm plugging the fall issue, but it's just in my mind.
As you should.
Yeah. So the first piece that has COVID content that we're publishing, I think we did a few pieces in the micro series, but in print, we have an essay called Cells, C-E-L-L-S by Kent Kosak.
Okay.
And he looks at the art of Louise Bourgeois and his own experiences previously in life, but also in COVID briefly is one of the threads of the essay.
Okay, interesting. So yeah, it sounds like for somebody to send a submission that deals with current events, it needs to have some other layer. It's not just about like, this was awful. This pandemic was really, really hard.
Yes.
But it's taking, that's a small part of a larger piece.
Yes.
And it's approaching it from a different angle.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation.
Okay, good. Yeah. So one thing I think a lot of people maybe have been talking about lately and are thinking about is like a sense that the literary world is like made up of like insiders, and you have to get published, you have to know the right people and have a connection and, have mentioned this teacher in your cover letter and blah, blah, blah. And I'm wondering how your magazine kind of combats that, and like the degree to which the magazine is truly open to like people from all backgrounds who don't have any connections in the literary world.
That is a really good and important question. I feel like I'm sure we succeed in some ways and fail in some ways. But I will say that we say that our readers don't have to read the cover letter before the submission. They need to take a look at it at some point in case it's like, hi, Rebecca, I remember we haven't seen you in 5 years, but we were best friends, So we need to make sure those sorts of things get to the right editor if they hadn't been screened to them in the first place. But, some people don't include a cover letter, and that's fine. We don't require it. I mean, sometimes it's nice to get a sense of where people are, but, I think about our contests. We just finished up our summer contests, and I think at least 2 of the 3 winners, this is one of their first or earliest pieces published. And for the fiction person, it's their first story published ever. And this is a person who is not, they're not working at a college, they're in a different field, and it's a fantastic story. So we love being the first publisher for people. It happens less often with poetry, I think, just because of the nature of how many poems one can write and how many magazines publish them both in print and online. But, we love it when we're the first publication for someone. And we're often surprised too, because, we're like, we can't believe it. So I'm actually working on nominations right now for the Penn Emerging Writers Award, the Robert Dow Award. And I love it when we have things to nominate for that, because that's for your first published story ever. And I love it that not every year, but almost every year we have at least one thing to send on. And this next year, it'll probably be one of our contest winners. And we do read mostly straight from the queue. We will solicit occasionally if our editors are needing to fill a space in the micro series in a fast time slot, or if we're almost finished with an issue and there's space left over. In those cases, we'll do some solicitation, or we might say, hey, make sure you submit, and here's our submission manager, and they'll end up in the queue. But we don't have, a small space set aside for people straight from the queue, and then, a bigger space for people we've solicited. That's not part of how we work.
Right.
Yeah.
Can you
I don't know if I've answered your question, but I've talked a lot.
Yeah, well, actually, it sounds, and this is what I tell people a lot in the submissions Q&A and just students, like contests are a great way to break in because, yeah, because they're anonymous. So it's really all about the work, and there's no name to distract the editors.
Our poetry winner who had been published elsewhere, she's 16 years old.
Wow, good for her. That's wonderful.
I know. Yeah. So I feel like, you know, we do it in other places as well. And I definitely see my editors trying to encourage younger writers too, if they say so in their cover letter, there's a personal note. But yeah, I mean, I definitely want to be a magazine that isn't just publishing people you've read 20 other times somewhere else. We'd like to have a good mix of emerging and established writers.
That's great. Yeah. And so the cover letter, it sounds like you read it after the fact, like you start with the work and then somewhere in the process of reading the work, you'll maybe take interest in who the writer is. Is that right?
Yeah. And we use Submission Manager, the CLMP, Council of Literary Magazines and Presses product that was developed by Devin Emke of One Story. And I know it's not as slick as Submittable, but there are definite benefits to it for us. And one is that the cover letter ends up in this little link and you have to click on it. It doesn't just show up unless someone's included it in their file. You know, it's not obvious to us. It's easy to not look at it until you want to.
Okay. So is there something specifically that you guys want to see more of maybe in terms of subject matter or style or voice?
I mean, we're always looking to make sure that we're being equitable and making sure we're giving space and being kind of a stepping stone for writers of color and writers of working class backgrounds, LGBTQIA plus writers, and writers with disabilities. And so although we use that submission manager, we do accept submissions by email or mail for people who are in prison or people who have disabilities for that reason. Because I feel like, you know, writing as someone who, or speaking as someone rather, who, you know, I have a chronic illness now, but I grew up with a lot of privilege. Like it's very, you know, I was able to go to college. I was able to go to an MFA. I was able to get into a PhD program and afford to, you know, live on the small stipend I got. And so I feel like there's a lot of, it's not just those stories that are interesting, because I feel like we read a lot of college stories too, or a lot of pieces set in writing programs by people who are probably currently in writing programs. And those are less interesting to me than a piece where someone is examining a different way of living than I have lived. I mean, I know the middle class white cis lifestyle. I don't need to read more about that. Although it can be done well too. So I don't want to say that we're not reading and accepting things like that either. But I guess it also too has to do again with the idea of risk. And, you know, making sure you're not appropriating or, you know, looking in from the outside. I feel like it's really hard to do stories about working class characters well. But then we've published a few of them in recent years by people who did it well. Yeah, so that again, I feel like I started to talk about something else as I talked about your question, but
that's fine.
Yeah, those are the sorts of things that we'd love to see more of, rather than more of who we are.
Yeah. Can you say, it's really interesting to me, like what it was about those particular stories that you felt like this is authentic, they're doing this well, you know, it's not like an overt, you know, pamphlet about the, you know, perils of class society, but they're handling the issue of class and they're honoring their characters, and like it all comes together. Like what, because I'm really interested in this just like from a craft perspective, like what did those writers do well that made it work?
So they avoided sentimentality. I feel like when you don't do it well, the writer is trying to make us feel bad for the working class person rather than saying this is the life, and here's the joys and the challenges of it, that kind of complexity that we've talked about. And so I have two stories in mind that did that well and that we've published. And one of them is going to be in the Best American Short Stories that's coming out this fall.
No way.
Yeah, the Jasmine Ward one. It's by Krista Romanowski.
Okay.
And it's it's got a long title that I'm not going to be able to remember, but it's about a mother who's a young single mother. Well, she's a widow, a young widow. I would guess in her 20s or early 30s, who's struggling because she lost her partner, because they've both experienced challenges with drug addiction, because she doesn't have a car, she has to ask someone to give her a ride. And yet it's not like, oh, feel sad for this person. You see her strength and grit, you see her make bad decisions. And again, it's like, it shows the complexity of life rather than simplifying it down to some reductive lesson. And similarly, Adam Latham, in an issue a few years back, wrote about a guy who sells romance novels at a swap meet. And so just even that concept alone, like, okay, you're doing something a little different. And so he, he describes the life, the daily lived life of this person and how they lost their girl to someone else who also works at the swap meet. But it's in a way that, he's not trying to make us feel sorry for this person. And so that's, I think, how they can succeed.
Right. That's so interesting. It's making me think the strength is like giving people their subjectivity and their quirks and their foibles, and just not writing about types, but actually giving those characters like real, true complexity and subjectivity. So on a different note, you mentioned the supply issues, which I know that's something that all editors, printers are dealing with right now. Can you talk about how that's affecting you guys?
Yeah, so we work with different printers, and when I approach them and say, hey, we've got an issue, can you give me an estimate of how much you think you could do this job for? And I want to say, how long will it take after we get files in? And they often will say things like 21 days, 25 days. My most recent one, it was 48 days, 52 days. So it's almost double what it has been in the past. And so there's a number of things going into that, as I'm sure those of you who have been following this know. Availability of paper, which has been an issue for a long time. The supply chain challenges every industry is having. Some of the paper comes from abroad, a good amount of it, I think, actually. And so they're warning us, you may not get your exact paper. We'll try and get it as close to it as we can. We'll work with you on that. The fact that their own staff is having times where they're not available to work because of illness or quarantine or things like that. The challenges of keeping staff that, every business is having. And then the fact that this is good, more people are reading or have been reading in the pandemic. So I think newer titles have struggled a little bit more, but backlist things have sold quite a lot, as have things by established writers. So, it's a good thing for indie bookstores. Order from your indie bookstores, look for your mid-list and your literary releases, but it's putting a strain on the industry because of that.
It's good. Sorry, just to clarify, it's good because it's forcing people to actually go back to stuff that's already printed, or how is it good for them?
No, it's good that people are reading.
I see. Okay.
Yes. Sorry, not that they're forced to go back. I work at also, I'm a poetry series editor at Acre Books.
Okay.
And so, I want you to read small presses, new releases.
Yeah. And is paper actually more expensive now too?
I think so. I haven't looked at that as closely, but we have, yes.
Okay.
I'll just say yes. It's not as astronomical as the length of time that we've been given. Prices are rising.
And so twice, it doesn't actually seem that bad. Like I thought it was like sort of indefinite, because I spoke to one editor who's his stuff is like been on the back burner for months. So do
Yeah,
you,
that's not a good relationship with a printer for sure.
yeah, do you,
Yeah.
but you guys feel certain that it will be out like in the time that they said?
Yeah, it might be a little bit longer, and that's 52
Okay.
business days.
Mhm.
So that's like 2
Yeah, because
months.
yeah, if you have weekend, right,
Yeah.
yeah,
So if we get it out in 2021, I'll be happy.
right, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I feel like because we've worked with the printers that we're working with before, we've been doing all right. We also perhaps aren't going with the largest of printers. We try to go with people who are in our region because shipping is less and we have good relationships with them. But yeah, I know some of the printers for larger books are having a really hard time. And then some printers abroad are having trouble shipping here. Like I know China is a great place to publish things that are full color books. It's more affordable, but you can't get them here. So that's the challenge.
Yeah. Wow, well, good luck with it.
Yeah.
So
Thank
is it affecting the submissions process as well? Like, will you guys take a break from open submissions?
Yes. So over the years, since we went to online submissions, every year our number of submissions has increased over time. So I think when we first started, we were getting like 4,000 or 5,000 submissions a year. And until last year, we were up to 8,000 non-contest submissions a year with that small staff that I talked about. And it's just gotten a little unfeasible. When people started staying home for the pandemic, we saw our numbers jump dramatically.
Wow.
And they haven't really gone down in the same way, which is a good thing. I'm glad people are writing. I'm glad they're submitting. But I feel like we're having to make some decisions on submission periods as a result. We used to start on September 1st and go through March 1st, and we kept moving that back. So last year it was December 1st. And then this year, because of the way that the student editors are working on genre teams with the genre editors, I wanted to do something a little bit different. And so we're having submission periods in September, in December, and May. So if you miss a submission period, there's one coming up soon enough. But we also have a cap because we just can't, we're taking more than a year in some cases to respond to people. And I feel like I would rather do a better job than that.
Sure.
And, you know, I see people getting upset that it takes that long to submit or takes that long to get a response. And it's not like we're sitting twiddling our thumbs, like we're just trying to get through the queue. And so what we're doing is we're opening up on September, December, or May 1st. And then we have a cap in mind, depending on what we have left over. So this, for September, we reached our cap by September 6th or 7th, I want to say. It was really fast. Yeah, we got a lot of submissions even on the first day.
Yeah.
I think some people are doing what I've tended to do myself lately, which is, oh, that venue's not open for submissions right now. Let me put it on my calendar.
Right.
And
So people should know this. They should submit ASAP.
Yes.
And when you say cap, you mean a number of submission. You don't mean like a cap on suitable pieces that you accept. It's like X number of submissions and then it's closed.
Yes. So throughout the entire year, I suspect we will end up reading fewer than those 8,000 non-contest submissions for a number of reasons. And again, I feel like it's, you know, we're a strong journal, but I don't think we're not this, it doesn't make sense for us to be like, oh yes, we will get back to you in a year and a half. Like we don't want to be that journal.
Yeah, that's good. I appreciate that as a writer. So I usually save this question for the end, but do you guys want readers? It sounds like you might be open to like volunteers and just additional help.
I mean, so part of the challenge is just the way that things get filtered up. We occasionally have taken on other readers, but we start with the people in the program and filling those spots first. So I feel like there are other magazines who could use the help more, if that makes sense. We have institutional support and we have kind of a ready pool of volunteers. But yeah, definitely get in touch with me if
Okay.
you have experience and some connection in some way to our staff.
Okay. And should people email you through the site or? Okay.
Yeah, there's a contact form on the site.
Okay, great. So tell us about your contest, because it sounds like that might be a good way. If you close submissions early, people can still enter the contest.
Yes, the summer contest goes from June 1st to roughly July 15th. And we're not, again, we're not accepting any other submissions at that time frame. And it's a $20 fee, and you get a subscription, a 1-year subscription. And so that if you live abroad, we are converting those to digital subscriptions, just because Europe is making it harder and harder to send things there. And also it's just very expensive. But you can also decide if you're a continental US person to get a digital subscription. So we have a set of readers who do an initial screening, and it's usually just one person per genre. So they're seeing everything and putting everything against itself rather than, farming it out to 10 people. And so something that someone else might have liked, it's a single mind looking at the entire pool. And they send a certain number of finalists to our genre editors to make a decision. But we also, again, we pay those initial readers. So with that and the cost of the subscription, we're not really making a lot of money on the contest, but we do see it as a way to make more connections with writers who could become our readers. And the whole goal of magazines is to, convert people to subscriptions at some point. So if you enter our contest and you want to resubscribe, whether it's by entering the contest again or just buying a subscription, that makes us very happy. We also have our micro series open nearly year round. It's not open during the contest, just to keep things simpler. And we also sometimes have to close it just because that also fills up. And we don't want people to be waiting, but we respond rather quickly to micro in comparison.
Yeah.
So if you have something that fits that bill, that's open a lot more often, and we get back to you. I think the max is like 6 months for that. It's much faster.
Okay. So that's good to know. And the submission period for the micro pieces?
Year round, except June 1st to July 15th. And again, occasionally we have to close it early, but we've only done that once in the past year. And it was only like 10 days early.
So people should just take a very long story and winnow it down to under 500 words.
Yeah, there you go. You're fine. Or just put December 1st or May 1st on your calendar.
Okay. So in terms of the, what was I totally forgot my question there.
About the contest?
It was, yes, actually, thank you. Yes. So I always tell people to try to submit to contests where the editors consider the work for publication as well.
Yes.
So
yeah, we do that. We definitely do that. Yeah. In addition to the winning pieces, we're publishing 2 other essays, another story, another poem, and there's a chance on another one, but that's still up. But yeah, we definitely do that as well.
That's
and that's a big help, again, for finding writers we might not have known before. When I looked at the list of finalists this year, there were 1 or 2 names that I recognized, and most of them were new to me, and that's great. And we can, we do pay attention to that in the future. If someone's like, hey, I was a finalist in the contest, like, okay, let's read this.
Oh, okay, great, yeah. So what's on the horizon for you guys? It sounds like there's a lot. It's just getting this issue to print, getting the work up online, submissions, contests.
Yeah. So we're approaching our 20th anniversary. So there's going to be a bunch of things. Yeah, thanks. We're reading for our 19th, our 19.1, our 19th volume, or 19th year of volumes coming up. And so that a year from so next spring 2023 will be right around the time we're at our 20-year anniversary. And so some things behind the scenes that are going on is we're going to do some strategic planning and think about what we're doing. Well, what are we doing well? Where could we improve? And especially I have in mind online content. Are we keeping up with trends? related to online content is our print magazine doing what other print magazines are doing these days. We are also, again, doing that stuff behind the scenes with changing who's making the decisions and including more people on the decisions. And then the professionalization projects, which you won't see directly, but you may see the results of, like if you get the email newsletter, which you can sign up for on our contact form. So again, like most of that's going to be behind the scenes, but I anticipate that eventually we'll be thinking about our website and whether we need to update it, whether we need to include more online content, and in what ways.
That's great. So tell us how people can find you, get more involved, talk about your newsletter, website, social media.
So we're at Cincinnati Review, which is Cincinnati.
I was embarrassed because I was going to say my very first question is, how do you spell Cincinnati? Because every single time I've talked about this journal, I have spelled it wrong. So thank you for
You're welcome.
Just to cover the basics there.
Yeah, so it's very simple, cincinnati-review.com. And then we have a contact us link on the right-hand top menu. And you can kind of just, we have a couple different, you can look at our masthead there, obviously. We have a link to our sales store, our submission guidelines, and then the micro series and kind of blog archives. We, in the past, started to try to start a YouTube channel, and I think another thing that we could do is kind of return to that and strengthen that a little bit. You know, the kind of thing that you're doing, it's fantastic.
Yay.
So I'm thinking about, you know, the kind of blog posts we're doing, and could we make that into a video instead?
Right.
Craft.
Yeah. That's a lot. Well, good luck with all of it.
Thank you. Oh, I should say we're also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram.
Yes. And so everybody should check out the social media sites, check out the website, subscribe to the newsletter so you get updates on calls for submissions, contests, submit during this wonderfully narrow window, get your work out there. And thank you so much for taking the time.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.